and welcome to the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. I'm Kieran O'Boyle, and today we're going to discuss mental health matters, understanding and supporting youth mental health. And this panel discussion forms part of the RCSI MyHealth series. As many of you will know, the series explores a wide range of health and well-being issues and brings together some of the leading healthcare experts in the field. And the goal is to empower you, people watching, to make more informed decisions about health and well-being. So today I'm joined by Professor Patrick McGorry, who's the Executive Director of Origin and Professor of Youth Mental Health at the Centre for Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. Professor Mary Cannon is based in the Department of Psychiatry here in the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. Lisa McCarthy is a third-year medical student here at RCSI. And we're also joined by Dr. Helen Coughlin from the Department of Psychiatry, again here at the RCSI. Welcome to the RCSI MyHealth series. So to begin, Pat, can I turn to you? Why is it important for us to talk about youth mental health?
Well, mental ill health is the biggest threat to young people's lives and futures. And every society is very dependent on the next generation coming through, and people often think, well, that's the little kids. But these days, the health of young children is never been better. The threats to their health and lives have really mostly been dealt with through advances in medicine and public health. But the big problem we have now is the deteriorating mental health of young people in transition from puberty through to mature adult life. So it's the 12 to 25 age group. And we know particularly from high-income countries, that their mental health has been deteriorating sharply over the last 15 years. And already it was the main period of life in which the adult-type mental illnesses like schizophrenia, depression, other mood disorders, eating disorder, all of those illnesses appear in this transitional phase from puberty through to, say, the mid-20s. So it's been massively neglected. It's caused a lot of unnecessary deaths, preventable deaths, and more subtly, lost futures where young people don't fulfill their potential or they end up on welfare, and it's a massive waste which society has failed to address.
Yeah. So it's a really important cohort and a vulnerable cohort. This is what we're talking about here. Thanks for that. Mary, can I turn to you? What do we know about youth mental health at this stage?
Well, the key thing we know about mental health in general, as Pat was saying, is actually it's an illness that onsets earlier in life. Because for all physical illnesses, your teens, your 20s, they're the healthiest part of life. But this is when the most of major mental illness actually starts. So we're moving in psychiatry and mental health more to early intervention now. We used to wait until things had got to a critical stage, but now we're thinking, okay, we need to tackle things early. We need to get to the root causes and the early signs. So this means we really have to focus on young people. And so it's taken a while, but I think slowly the focus is now shifting back, and we have to create the services to match that, for that age group.
So this is as important for adult psychiatry as it is for
it is, because if
we're preventing, we're getting
exactly,
in early.
If you can move in early, you could possibly prevent illnesses,
yes,
in later life, or improve their outcomes so they don't become chronic illnesses.
Right. Yeah. That's quite a hopeful sort of way of thinking. Lisa, same question to you. What's your take on youth mental health?
Yeah, I think it's constantly evolving. So I think that as a young person today, the issues of mental health, they've always affected generations before you, but today the way in which you're affected by them and the things that you're affected by are always changing. So comparison has never been more available to young people, comparing your own situation to other people's situations through the internet and through technology. So the inputs that you're receiving every single day that affect your mental health, I think that's outpacing at times our ability to support young people, because we don't always know what those things are until it's on the news or there's been research done about it. So I think that's a really big challenge for mental health professionals and young people too.
That's really interesting. It's a complete difference from the time I grew up. I mean, the pressures are very different, and the connections are huge, and the challenges are huge for young people. Yeah. Helen, can I ask you the same question, your perspective?
Yeah, and just listening to Lisa there, I think there's a really interesting thing happening around youth mental health at the moment, which is that young people are talking massively about mental health. It is very much in the language of youth, and we know young people are increasingly talking about it, and they identify it as a significant issue for themselves and their peers. Where there's a real kind of struggle or tension is that what we find is young people are very, very adept and willing to talk about mental health, about their peers, their friends, their siblings, but there remains a stigma and a self-stigma often for young people about possibly acknowledging their own struggles, their own difficulties. And there's something about, being able to talk about you and somebody I know, as opposed to that real difficulty of saying, well, it's actually me who's struggling. And what we're trying to do, I think, in the youth mental health space and field is to encourage those young people and those who are actually suffering to be able to say, actually, I am not okay. Yes. And really highlighting the message that being able to say that and to let people know and to reach out for support is really important. But there's still work to be done with young people. They're reluctant often to reach out and seek help.
So the stigma is reducing, but it still needs to be reduced much further. Is that?
Yeah, so the stigma still, societally,
yes.
There's stigma around mental ill health, certainly. So people are very comfortable talking about mental health, not so much about mental ill health or mental illness. But really, one of the biggest barriers for young people is self-stigma.
Yes.
So it's a perceived perception that you are somehow failing or weak, or that you're going to be exposed as or pushed aside or judged because you are struggling with your mental health, or that you certainly will judge yourself. And until we get over that real stigma that people apply to themselves, we're really going to have to tackle that one, as well as things like services and resources that young people need.
Good, thank you. And we'll come to resources in a little while. Mary, we're coming through, hopefully, at the end of this pandemic. So what has the impact of the pandemic been, do you think, on youth mental health?
Yes, it's obviously something we're still studying, because as you say, we're just coming out of this now. But it's seeming from data that we're collecting from secondary school students at the moment that it has had a big impact on mental health. In fact, in one recent survey of 15, 16-year-olds, 40% of the boys and 60% of the girls felt that their mental health had worsened during the pandemic and after the pandemic. So that's a huge proportion. And now we haven't quite figured out what are the aspects of the pandemic that have caused this. So we need to tease this out a bit more. But loneliness seems to be something they do talk about a lot, and that increase, go back to at least the increase in social media use, and also for some young people an increase in substance use, and I suppose a lack of their structured activities. So there's a number of factors, and hopefully some of this may wash out, but a lot of it may not, and we need to we need to monitor this over the coming years.
It's very interesting. The Surgeon General in a report last year said that this is the most connected generation ever, but the loneliest generation ever. That's kind of coming through in some of this research. Lisa, your friends, your colleagues, what would they say about the impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think just to go back to your comment there, like there's a song called Modern Loneliness, and it's we're never alone but always depressed. And I think that maybe captures what possibly it's like to be a young person today, that you're never really alone because you're always able to reach out to people, yet you're still feeling lonely, and that can be quite complex. So some research that a classmate of mine, Anna Whitaker, did with Mary actually on students at RCSI revealed that a lack of motivation was something that really people experienced, and that is around just that hunger for life. People didn't necessarily feel that in the last 2 years. And I think that comes from not being able to plan beyond the weekend. As a young person, you want to dream, you want to have big dreams, but when you're not able to plan beyond the weekend, I think that really impacts your motivation to work towards some of those dreams. And then other issues like anxiety because of the unpredictability, and then loneliness and isolation. So particularly for new college students, not having or feeling connected to your college because you haven't made those friends or you haven't connected with your professors or your course. And then for the more senior students, I suppose, actually not having those milestone moments, which really solidify your college experience or your young adult years. So I think those would be the main three things that really were themes that emerged from that research.
It's very interesting. And of course, there's been tremendous intergenerational solidarity, because young people have given up a lot because for older people like me to protect. Pat, would it be the same in Australia? Would the same
No, very
kind of
similar to what Mary and Lisa are saying. But your point just then about intergenerational solidarity, which is pretty remarkable, because one of the causes, there's a recent book published by the KCL, Bobby Duffy in London, it's called Generations, and it talks about why this is actually happening to young people, and some of the mythology that the generations like Generation Y and X and Z, that they're somehow completely different planets from each other. There's much more commonality there, actually, really. But what has happened over the last 15, 20 years in the neoliberal world that we live in is a wealth transfer from young people to old people, and there's been a massive neglect of young people actually in across the board in socioeconomic terms, which is affecting all of these things. And that the Surgeon General that you mentioned, he comments on these things in his report just before Christmas last year, and refers to this youth mental health crisis. And it hasn't come out of the blue; it's come out of mega trends in society, making an existing problem worse. And the pandemic's just the next layer of insult on top of it, which has increased need for care by 25%. It's not just diffuse things like loneliness. That sounds like a normal problem that everyone has, but actually it's more serious than that. We've seen a big surge in anorexia, a big surge in caseness, in need for care, not just more social contact, but need for professional help. And that's on a low base. Here in Ireland, there are major problems in even meeting the needs of young people in transition, even before the pandemic. Massive holes in the system, which the government has not really dealt with yet. They have made some green shoots with Jigsaw and other initiatives and what Mary's work here, but it's massively underestimated by governments all around the world, the need here, and also the payoff, which we mentioned at the beginning, the payoff. It's a really form of self-harm that society inflicts on itself by neglecting young people and not looking after them, because they are the power generation that's going to lead us into the next phase.
And that plays out for years. Helen, so if we come to talk now a little bit about what we can do, or what people themselves can do, how do we protect young people's mental health?
And I think it's really, really an important question, and what we certainly how I would look at it and think about it, and coming back to Lisa's point, there are things that all of us can do to nurture and promote our mental health. And so that's our starting point, is that we need to do that. Really interesting to hear those findings, for example, from students about that loss of hopes and dreams. And because we know that people who have good mental health and young people have hopes and dreams, have a sense of a purpose, have a future in mind, and that holding on to those hopes and dreams really matters in terms of your mental health and your well-being. But other things really matter too. Connection to others. We are born to be in relationship with other people. Connections matter hugely, and so again we see in the pandemic how that disconnection really affected all of us, and certainly young people at a time where they're forging and really trying to find your place in space. When people have good mental health, they tend to feel a sense of belonging in the world. And when you're young, there's this whole phase where you're trying to explore who you are, your identity. It's completely natural and normal to explore that and to struggle and to wonder. But what really helps young people is to feel that they found their people. And when you're young, and sometimes in Ireland and in other places, there's a sort of bit of pressure to conform. And there isn't always space to have your own identity that might be different. So what we're always saying to young people is that, try to find those like-minded others and find a place and space for yourself. Find and have meaning. It's not about the quantity of connections. It's not about likes on Instagram. It's about quality of relationship and connection. It's about holding, as I said, onto those dreams and those wishes. The other thing, though, in terms of protecting young people's mental health is that we know, for example, that if you've got stress or adversity or trauma, that's a risk factor for you. So we need to try and reduce stress. We need to help young people learn coping mechanisms to deal with stressful life events. or stressors, but we also need to recognise the impact of some of those life experiences that young people are living through and experiencing, and respond meaningfully to them. And in terms of protecting young people's mental health, we also, as Pat said, we need to have services and supports available for young people, so that when we encourage them, and hopefully they do reach out, that they are met by something or someone who can actually meet their needs and respond in a meaningful way.
Okay. So it's a question of the individual, but also the system being able to support people as they transit through these really important stages, developmental stages.
Yeah, and we need to think of it as a continuum, and we
Yes.
have to acknowledge that on that continuum, even for young people who do all what they're told are the right things to protect their mental health, for some young people, they'll still transition and have very serious and significant mental health difficulties, and that is not a failure on the part of any young person. It's not a failure on them, and we have to be really careful about that language around do all this and you'll be fine. Sometimes young people aren't fine, and that can't be on them to feel responsible, and we have an onus and a duty to respond to them and provide, as I said, a suite and a range of services that are tailored to meet their needs.
Lisa, how does that resonate with how you would see things?
So I would completely agree with what Helen's saying there. I mean, finding a group of people that perhaps you don't have a connection with them outside of the particular activity that you're doing, whether that be sport, art, music, dance, whatever it is, poetry. But the fact that there's a group of people relying on you to show up on a weekly basis, to do your part, to contribute, it is so valuable for your self-esteem, your self-confidence, and equally, and you've kind of mentioned it there, it gives you access to a whole other support network outside of your immediate family and friends, where you have this shared interest and this passion for something that maybe isn't your college course or your job. It's something distinct that you get to spend time doing that you really love with people who love it too. And I think a really important aspect of that is it also gives you access to this intergenerational friendships. So if you're on a team, for instance, with people who are a few years older than you, people who are a few years younger than you, you can help out the younger people. That gives you that self-esteem. But people older than you can actually provide guidance that perhaps your parents or your guardians can't offer to you at a given point in time in your life. So it just opens out that support network and makes it more available to you. So I think that's finding that community, whatever it is so valuable.
And just in response to that, it is really interesting. There was the biggest survey of youth mental health in Ireland, the My World survey, that was undertaken by Barbara Dooley and colleagues in UCD, and in collaboration with Jigsaw, found that having access to a trusted adult was a hugely protective factor. This intergenerational kind of dynamic and being connected and having a trusted adult in your life protected a lot of young people. You know, so they scored much better on scales of anxiety, depression. You know, they were more connected with their peers. So we're always encouraging young people and adults in young people's lives to turn up and be present for them, because we know that really matters. We know it does.
It's remarkable how many of us would say, if you look back on people who have influenced us in our own careers, how often teachers, you know, lecturers, people like that, there's kind of ways in which we in the academic community can help. So just bringing that on, Mary, schools and colleges have a major role here, but clearly we have to support teachers, academic staff, professional staff in moving this on. What's your sense of that, how that can be done?
You're right, this is a very important area. This is school is where children spend, and young people spend the majority of their day. And the My World survey, as Helen was talking about earlier, in that survey, the young people identified anxiety about school, anxiety about exams in particular, as a major stressor for them. So we definitely can't ignore the role of schools in this. And also, I suppose the schools have we can't ignore also the issue of bullying in schools. I mean, that's a major stressor for young people and needs to be tackled within the school environment. So schools have two roles to play, one in identifying young people at risk and the other in educating young people about mental health, about how to overcome these, how to avoid the risk factors, how to boost up the protective factors and seek help. We have here in RCSI recognised the importance of educating educators, and we have a website called mentalhealtheducate.ie, which is available on our website to provide. It was initially for teachers, but we're also aiming it at parents and guardians, so people can just learn about a little about mental illness, so they can better communicate with their youth. So there's a huge role here for schools, and the governmental task force in 2017 recognised that as one of the recommendations to improve mental health input into schools and education of teachers and educating teachers to recognise the early warning signs. So
thanks for that, Mary. We'll put those websites up on the session for anybody who wants to follow up on that. Pat, you have a great deal of experience in this space. So for people watching, when we think about the things that might indicate that a young person is actually struggling with their mental health, what would be the main markers that there's a problem there?
Well, one of the challenges is some of the myths about adolescence and that somehow everyone's got to suffer, that it's normal to have, emotional turmoil and all of that kind of stuff. Well, obviously, like as Helen was explaining, it's a very challenging period of life, and there are lots of, risks and risk-taking is necessary and all that sort of stuff. So you don't want to medicalise everything, but it's pretty simple really, and people get tied up in ideological knots about this stuff all the time, about labelling and this kind of stuff. But really, when someone's distressed for a significant period, more than a few days, or if their lives are clearly going south, like in their relationships or their study or their vocational pathways, and they might not recognise it as Helen said themselves, or admit it, or be able to reach out. But the people around them have to recognise it. It's called the second circle, and that's the peer group, coming to what Lisa's saying. And if this is the problem of the pandemic, the peer group was detached, so a whole lot of people fell into a big hole, without any sort of safety nets. And so the second circle, the parents are obviously critical. By and large, no one cares more about the kid than the parents, and they'll do anything for their kids. So they have to actually be tapped into as a resource. And a lot of professionals are trained in this massively individual way, and they try to exclude the family and on the basis of confidentiality and privacy. Now, obviously, you've got to respect that because you've got to form a relationship with the young person when you try to help them as a therapist. But there's a way of doing it without casting the scaffolding aside, whether it's the peer group. And one of the things I'd say, and I'm sure Helen and Mary, which we've worked together on for years on, we cannot build the right cultures of care without the young people's leadership and collaboration, because that's the secret weapon we've had. That's why we have made the progress that we've had, because the young people like Lisa have helped us to design it and operate it in the right way. And that's been a massive learning experience for us as professionals.
It's very interesting what you say there about families, because families are systems, complex systems, so the elements of the system have to be involved in the process here.
Exactly, yeah. And that doesn't mean we have to go back to 1970s family therapy where everyone has to sit in a room for 6 months, but we get more practical about those things and use a bit of common sense sometimes too. But the other thing I'd say is, if you can demonstrate through oases of quality care that a transformational approach to this area is possible, that's what is happening now. That's the progress. We know an awful lot more can be done about this problem. So this sense of pessimism and defeatism that you see right throughout mental health care around the world has got to be overcome. And Ireland's one of the countries that's got the potential to do that. It's already made some very good early steps that Helen referred to, but it'll strengthen the country enormously if this issue is tackled more seriously.
And that's what you've done in Australia with True Origin, I think. Is that, am I right, Pat? These centres?
Yeah, we've done similar things, I'd say we're still at the base camp. We've got a base camp at least, or a launching pad, but still, a lot of young people are not getting the help that they need and deserve. And then the risk factors, which we started to talk about, have got to be addressed as well. Society's got to take a good hard look at itself, all around the world, around the fate of young people.
Mm-hmm. So following on from that, Helen, so for people watching again, you know, what should we do when we start to become concerned, parents, teachers, colleagues, friends, and so on? What's the advice there and what we should be doing?
I'm going to start with something really, really core, because it's very easy to rush to do. And before we ever do, if we're worried about someone, or we know someone is struggling, or a young person has reached out, is the capacity to sit and listen and acknowledge what they're experiencing before you do anything else. And one of the things, particularly we know with parents, who, as Pat said, like, they are typically, you know, there to protect and want and have this desperate urge to do so, is the risk that you rush in to solve or give advice or dismiss potentially the issue. And so what I always say to people is, if you can find a way to just start with this notion of empathy, which matters to all of us, it's a human need, that if we are struggling or in distress, that somebody recognizes our subjective experience of that and sit in that place first. And that is a starting point, because we have to understand and hear from the young people themselves, from each person, what is going on for them, for us to truly be able to offer them the support that they need. So that means just holding back from jumping in, not quickly rescuing, not solving all the problems for your young people. And then once you can do that and sit with that listening and understand, certainly then we can move to try and either, if it's a problem, we know that coping mechanisms and problem solving, you can work through things with young people. Sometimes just listening, just being heard, just having your needs recognized, or the stuff you're struggling with, can make a massive transformation for young people. But of course there are other young people who are, as Pat said, when you're looking at, you know, it's been going on for weeks, it's affecting their lives, you know, the stuff that's happening for them is more significant, then we do need to look to try and reach out and connect in with services and supports potentially for young people, and try to route them to the ones that are most appropriate to the needs that they have.
That's really interesting. So it's stepping back, it's really the listening. Yeah. Parents often feel helpless in these kinds of situations when these problems are emerging. They don't know what to do or where to start, and then difficult to get access to services. So that would be the starting point, to just take it
because it's a lot of pressure, I think, on parents always to do and fix.
Yes, indeed.
And we know that it's complicated. So if we're and you know, if we think about our own times that we've struggled or had times where we felt very anxious or our mood has dropped, that what we often want, so you're always trying to think, I always say it's helpful to think about things in parallel. So there's often two things happening, you know, and that there might be opportunities for growth or resilience, or, you know, through adverse experiences, but we have to recognize what's happening. And young people, one of the things for young people is that they struggle with reaching out often to get help, particularly actually boys and young men. Now, if we don't get it right, so if you are a young person and you reach out and you come forward and you share, and you're not met with empathy, if someone's not listening, if they rush in, or they don't hear correctly, or they kind of really misread, young people have said in research they may never go back and seek help again. So it's almost about giving yourself permission to not do, and just be with someone first, and to recognize there is immense sort of therapeutic value in that alone. That doesn't mean that it solves everything or that it's the only thing to do, but it is an essential and like a really powerful thing to start with. Yeah.
I often think about Eric Fromm's book, Doing and Being. What we're talking about here is being with the person rather than doing. Yeah. So when it comes to the point of looking for assistance, here in Ireland, Mary, what kinds of services are available in relation to young people?
Well, I suppose there's a range of levels of services, and I suppose one of the first things to do, I suppose, would be to look for information. And so, you know, there's very reputable sites that can give information, such as the spunout.ie is really good for young people themselves to access information about a range of mental health conditions and how they could get support, written in very kind of friendly language for young people. Jigsaw.ie also has supports, and indeed Jigsaw could be, I suppose, the first port of call for some kind of problems. Jigsaw is this organisation that provides counselling and anxiety management support to young people aged between 12 and 25, and it's a self-referral system, or a parent can refer in, or a teacher. So it's very, and you get free 6 to 8 free sessions. So that's a good first port of call. But there are young people who may need more specialised care than that. So in that case, I think you'd need to talk to your family doctor, your GP, and perhaps look for a referral to your GP. May feel that they can deal with the issue, and often they are trained. They have had some mental health training themselves during their general practice training, but they may refer on to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, which we call CAMS, and that's for up to 18. And then, or if a child is 18 or over, it would be to the adult mental health service. And every address in the country is entitled to, every person in the country is entitled to care in their local team. So there will be a team attached to where you live. And then, of course, if you're in college, there's a range of counselling supports, and each college, for instance, RCSI here has a large range of supports for students. So there will be a student health centre or a student counselling centre in each college.
Yeah. Thanks. Do students use those facilities? Is that where they would turn naturally? Is it from your friends, your colleagues?
Yeah, part of the research that Anna Whitaker and Mary were working on is asking those sorts of questions. Yes. I think similar to Helen's point earlier, there still is that stigma of actually asking for help, but the first port of call may be to actually an online resource where you can get maybe a soft introduction to what might therapy even look like. Because I think there's an intimidation there where maybe you see, and it sounds ridiculous, but you see it in a movie and you're like, my goodness, that is not for me. So I think the first introduction might be through a Google search or an Instagram page or an influencer actually saying, I went to therapy and it was the best thing that I've ever done, for instance. And I think that's how people begin to actually say, maybe that's a soft introduction before they actually go and they reach out. But certainly the research that has been worked on does show that people actually do take the college counselling services up. I think you get 12 free sessions here at RCSI, and that people do actually use them and actually find them very rewarding once they get access to them.
Right. We'll talk in a moment about take-home messages, but I'd just like to come back to something, Pat, that you said earlier. We've talked about, mental health problems in young people, but this notion that adolescence and, that transition stage always has to be terribly difficult, and so we've kind of framed that in Western thinking. But many people will go through these phases and they'll be fine.
Well, there's a study in New Zealand from Christchurch that followed young people from, I think it was maybe late primary through to the age of 30, and they found that 50% of the young people during that phase met the threshold for a need for care. So you could say it's 50-50, but 50 is a lot. Just picking up on what Lisa and Helen and Mary were saying, that the soft entry idea, that's what Helen I think was alluding to, it, how to engage the person, how to listen, how to engage. That first contact can be crucial, for good or ill, But it's also the culture that professional is sitting in. It's not just that the single practitioner model doesn't work. Basically, you need a team horizontally integrated, in the primary care level like Jigsaw and Headspace in Australia. But then the big weakness now is not so much the entry portal, although that needs still a lot of attention, I'd say, and support. And maybe there are new ways to access it, like Lisa was saying, Instagram and so on, influencers and new concepts for us, But the big hole is the backup system. We call it the missing middle in Australia, because 2/3 of those young people that come into those first stage primary care type things like you just heard about, 2/3 of them need more than that. They need expertise, of a higher level and for a longer period than a few sessions, And they've got more complex and probably more dangerous or threatening problems. And just make another comment about the parents too, because the parents, trying to get them to adopt the right stance, as that Helen was saying, it can be very difficult when you've got a young person in the upstairs bedroom self-harming or starving themselves to death or hallucinating. So that's not something you can approach with a great equanimity. And so the parents do need a lot of education, support and assistance. And what they find, beyond that primary care approach, like they go to the GP does their best, but they need more, and they're presented with waiting lists of 12 months, that is a very unacceptable situation, which is in every high-income country for these young people.
And it's really serious because we're talking about potential. I mean, to be blunt about it, we're talking about these are life-threatening.
The biggest
situations.
cause of death for young people in Australia is suicide, but by a mile now. And our Prime Minister that just lost office a couple of weeks ago, he made that one of his big targets to reduce that. And I think that was one of the prime movers behind Jigsaw getting going in Ireland, the suicide rate in young people. These are preventable deaths, every single one of them.
Yeah, that's incredibly. And how would you say that in terms of Ireland, Mary? The suicide rate, how big the suicide rate is?
We had, for many years, a problem with young male suicide rates. We were one of the highest in Europe. We're still high, but it's coming down. And I think because of this focus that the government has put on suicide prevention, and previous governments have really targeted that. They have set up a whole agency, the National Suicide Prevention Foundation, to tackle this, and there is a whole Connecting for Knife policy. So it shows when the government focuses on something, you can actually get results. Now, I suppose what we would like to do is broaden out from just suicide prevention to all mental health, and if there was the same focus, we could really achieve something.
Yes, yeah, that requires investment and political action and so on, and that's important. So can I hold with you there, Mary? I'm just going to go around the panel and just ask, for people watching, watching this, what would be your key take-home messages be for people?
I suppose following on from what we were just talking about, I think we need more political attention on mental health, particularly for young people. Our services are struggling. I mean, I mentioned the child and adolescent mental health services. I mentioned the adult services. They're woefully under-resourced in this country. And money was poured into physical health services during the pandemic, but it wasn't poured into the mental health services at all. So if we could have that political attention, and the way to achieve that would be advocacy on the ground. I think young people, I think parents, family members need to make their voices heard here and say, this is important to us. And then, I think then change could happen.
Yeah, so we need to be talking to our public representatives and so on. Thanks for that. Same question, from your perspective, what's the take-home message from the way you would see this?
I think for me, and this is even from personal experience, just never underestimate the value of a text or a call or a random act of kindness for any young person. So, I mean, right now, if there's a young person on your mind, maybe they're your child or someone that you interact with, just reach out to them, say, I thought of you. Because feeling that you're valued by someone, maybe you have a photo together, whatever it is, maybe an article that you read that you thought of them, just send it to them. Because I think that that's so valuable for a young person to feel like, or anyone to feel like, that they've been thought of in a given moment. So
that's very interesting, because sometimes people tend to sit back and kind of don't want to intervene, but you're saying open out and build the links. Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Helen, what would your take on that, your take-home message be?
Yeah, I think, and follow on from Lisa, I suppose there's a couple of things. I think for parents, and in response to what Pat is saying, is to also get support for yourself as a parent, particularly if you've got a young person who's struggling, it's a huge amount to carry if you've got a young person who, and we know there are many young people who are struggling out there, and many parents who are really trying to find a way to be there and to get those supports. So mind yourselves if you are minding young people. And of course I will come back to empathy and listening, and never underestimate the power of that being, as you said, rather than doing. And it's an incredibly pivotal and powerful starting point for any young person to feel that they are with someone who's able to just be with them and hear what's going on for them. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. And Pat, finally, it's great to have you here in Ireland. You've been involved in this for many years. What's your take-home messages for people watching us?
Yeah, I think at two levels. One is that for the young people themselves and for their family and friends, don't give up, even if you are hitting barriers and trying to get help, because it could be life-saving, you know.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be a way if you fight hard enough at that level. But I really agree with what Mary said, actually. And in Australia, we've had a Royal Commission in the state of Victoria because the mental health system was allowed to deteriorate, you know, especially the specialist system, you know. And they realised they had an antiquated system which was divided into child and adolescent and adult mental health. That's fine for physical health problems. It doesn't work at all for mental health problems. There's a huge weakness in the middle, which is what we've been talking about today, the adolescent young adult part. And they've agreed to shift the upper boundary of the youth bit to age 25 to map onto the headspace, which is the primary care system, the jigsaw system here. So that's the best thing that could happen here in Ireland, not just money and people, but restructuring, you know, and making the system strongest, you know, where it needs to be strong. And Mary's done some great work within the college here to create a faculty of youth psychiatry. So you'll get a whole new cohort of emerging young psychiatrists who are trained in this specialty, really. It needs to be. The child and adolescent is inadequate for this, and so is the adult. They come out of different traditions, and they're both short of the mark. This is a new field we've been creating together around the world. Ireland's been very important in that. That's achievable with a bit of vision and innovation, and the country's shown that over the last, you know, couple of decades. I think it's been very, very progressive, and this is the opportunity here to go to the extra mile. If that's done, you get hope and optimism into the system, and instead of the pessimism that you see in many parts of mental health, and even among the young people. There's a quote from a young person, you know, coming out of COVID saying, you know, we always get the raw deal of everything. You know, coming back to what you were saying about all the money that was spent on physical health and nothing to support the young people. So we've really got to think differently and in a reform-minded way. That's on the geopolitical level, if I want to put it that way.
Sure.
But it's possible in a country like Ireland. It really is. And then the people, it's got to come from the people. It's people power. That's the Royal Commission in Victoria was powered by people. And if the people of Ireland recognise the importance of this problem, it would happen very quickly, I think.
Yeah, and this is something that affects millions of people. I mean, in every country, developed to developing. I'm reminded by what say Einstein's quote: "We can't think our way out of problems using the same thinking we thought to get into them." So we need a fresh, new way of thinking about this cohort of young people who fall between the stools of the child and adolescent psychiatry and then adult psychiatry.
That quote reminds me of the slide I used the other day, which was the invention of the electric light didn't come from quality improvement of candles.
Excellent. That's probably a perfect point in which to wrap up, a hopeful point for some light for the future. Thank you all very much. And that concludes our discussion today. My sincere thanks to our guest speakers, to Pat, to Mary, to Lisa, and to Helen. Further details on upcoming events in the RCSI MyHealth series can be found on the RCSI website. So, from all of us here at the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences, thank you for watching and stay well.